Stand up nation. How we doing today, folks? Mondays, am I right? You guys know. Um, I'm here with no hat today to talk to you about George Carlin. Um, some say the godfather of stand-up comedy. Um, and yeah, talking as you know, talking about, is he a good comedian? Is he bad? Is he funny? Is he not? Is kind of not what this course is about. Um, but you can certainly weigh in on that because he can be a polarizing figure. Um, Mainly when it comes to that line between being funny and being preachy. He, of all the comedians ever, seemed really walked that line um, trepidatiously, let's say, and that he often was going back and forth over that line um, repeatedly. And I my interpretation has always been it speaks to the passion that he has for it shows that he really cares about these things that he's talking about. Um, I can I can totally see how it can be off-putting to people who don't see it that way, who see it differently. Um, but I always look at it this way: the correlation between comedians, stand-up comedians, and like preachers, like more than like priests in the Catholic or rabbis or something, but like Southern evangelical like preachers, stump preachers, and things like that. Um, those those aren't a far cry from each other. When you really stop and think about it. In fact, the comedians that we're going to watch this week have some of them have backgrounds in super religious, grew up super religious in like Baptist homes and were actual preachers of the Bible and the gospel, whatever you want to call it, before they got into comedy, before they sort of realized, like, wait a minute, like, I don't believe any of this stuff or whatever. So those two communities are very closely related. And I always looked at comedians as atheist priests in many cases. You could define them that way, right? There's no atheist church with priests and organized religion, but if there were, I mean, you'd have to point to comedians as the spokespeople for that. Um, Comedians and scientists, I guess. Um, but comedians seem to be preaching it more than scientists are. So yeah, comedians as atheist priests, and I think Carlin is at the forefront of that movement, if you will. Um, so a bunch of stuff out front about Carlin that most of it we covered in class on uh, last week. So I'll just give you um, a little briefing. He did comedy for 60 plus years, like on TV, in movies, on stages, on HBO, all that stuff. 60 plus years. So that those bits about human rights, right, where he's really looks old. Like he was like 80 plus doing that show, and he died shortly after that performance was filmed. Um, and that's just impressive to be not only to be a working, successful, reputable comedian for that long, but to be pushing, constantly changing your act with the times. responding to injustices and bullshit that you encounter and over decades and decades and decades of comedy being sort of this, you know, I don't know, a signpost for uh, logic and reason and comedy all at once. Um, you saw there's a handful of interviews in the clip that I showed you guys, and I think those are as important as his comedy. I said this in class, but like he was really the first comedian to garner the respect of thinkers, right? He was the first to sort of kind of wade into that pundit pool where people started to ask him to be interviewed or to talk about various topics in the government and politics and things like that because they valued his opinion as a thinker, not as a comedian necessarily, but as a thinker. And that was really important to hear him talk about these things outside of the context of the stage, where he puts on his I'm the comedian, so being funny and how his material translates to very easily to, just regular political discourse or public discourse. So those interview segments, not the interview at the second interview, but the ones within that larger compilation clip. That was an important. He was important for that movement towards legitimizing the comedic as valuable to discourse and things like that. One of the pillars of this course is his whole jester, philosopher, poet thing. Now, I put poet second. Philosopher is the goal for me. So I tweak that a little bit. But I feel like you can all take any comedian you've ever seen and place them somewhere on that timeline, right? Some never graduate from the jester phase because why? Some people are like, why would I? I'm making a ton of money. I'm famous. I don't need anything more than this. I guess that's fine. And then poet, yeah, jester is just joke. Like make them laugh at all costs, whatever it takes. Physical comedy, voices, like all that kind of stuff. And then poet is you start to just make it more eloquent. You make it more fulfilling linguistically, and then the ideas. Once you get the ideas with the words and the jokes, you're a philosopher, and it's the complete package basically, and that's what I mean. I've said that too. Like philosophers like Kierkegaard and Kant and Sartre and Nietzsche and all these do they exist anymore? They do. They're comedians for the most part. At least in our culture. That's what I feel like. Comedians are the philosophers of our time. And when they do it like Carlin, when they do it like Pryor, when they do it like, I think Sarah Silverman, when they do it like Bill Hicks, when they do it like, the list goes on, they become philosophers. And I think that's an important relationship to understand. Like comedy is the same search for truth as philosophy is. Let's put it that way. And the idea that the jokes adorn the ideas, whereas the clown or the jester, it's just jokes without ideas for the most part, right? The joke should adorn the ideas and brighten them and enhance them and make them more clear or give a different perspective. And Carlin, I mean, he embraced that That's pretty obvious, right? Um, he talks about in the interview, that little 30-minute interview is just, I mean, that could be the class. You could just watch that every day and talk about it, pick it apart. But his idea of, similar to what we talked about before with Pryor, Pryor and Lenny Bruce to some extent, that fuck it moment, right? He had the same idea, like this, the mainstream dream is what he talks about. He had been convinced that what he wanted was what he wanted was fame and fortune and to be a star, and you be a disc jockey, then you're a comedian, then you're a movie star, TV, and then movies, right? Like that was the mainstream Danny Kaye dream, and that it took him a while, but he realized that ran counter to who he really was, right? He had to find out who he really was before he was like, fuck that. Like, I don't want any of that. He's a countercultural icon. He's a countercultural comedian. So he doesn't want anything to do with the mainstream dream, right? And so many people do. And so many people get blinded by that they never really identify who they are, what they really want. And, I talked about that in class, I think. It was really interesting because I hadn't thought about it that way until we were in the middle of this discussion. But I think that phenomenon occurs now more than ever, right? The American dream itself is virtually unattainable, right? With what it's sort of morphed into. Now it's like you have to be super rich and have tons of cars and houses and a TV show, and like the Kardashians basically is the American dream now. And when you buy into that and you're chasing that thing that you probably will never achieve, you never really stop to say, is this what I really want, or is it what? So until you shed that, you're going to be spinning your wheels. And he talks about realizing, wait, I'm not that guy. I'm this guy, right? And the interesting thing was, he was 30 in the 60s. He was 30, so he was caught between the generations, right? He was caught between people in their 40s coming to his show, and establishment basically, and people in their 20s sort of rioting and protesting a war and counterculture. So like culture and counterculture, and he was right in the middle. And that was an interesting breakdown. When you think about it. So that was his fuck it moment. How different is that description from Pryor's description of walking out to the mic, looking out and seeing all these 40, 50-year-old white people and being like, what the fuck am I doing? So that idea of the mainstream dream and how it can be as destructive as it is intoxicating, basically, and distracting from who you really are, and then having the fuck it moment. And then that's when he started doing new material, right? Throwing out the old stuff every year or two, working on a new special that is relevant, that is pertinent to the times and all that kind of stuff. Something we didn't really get to in class is how much of a language comic he is. He's always interested and focused a lot on language and just the words we use and how we use them and how we misuse them and their origins and things like that. And the bit from the compilation that I posted about euphemisms and how we've used language, basically rich white people, those in power, have used language to conceal their evil deeds and sort of mute or neuter an entire country of feeling. And the great example would be the term used to be shell shock, and now it's post traumatic stress disorder, like adding syllables, putting distance between, and it's really theoretical linguistic stuff, but he makes it funny and interesting. He was always invested in that. He was, famous for a long time for his seven, the 7 words you can't say on television, and protesting basically against, like, why are these words any worse than other words? And he really breaks it down in interesting, funny ways, obviously. And there was a whole FCC thing. He did it. It was on his album. Radio stations started playing that bit on there, and the FCC like shut him down. It was a whole thing. So language, he was really invested in that. And like when you think about language, it's one of the most important things that we never think about. The way we talk to each other and the way we communicate, and the power that we give to words and things like that. And Pryor did a little bit with that, but Carlin, it was a staple of his act for a long time, for most of his career, and it was just something that he found really interesting. Countercultural, much of comedy at the time, like in the 70s and 80s, reinforced the norms, the cultural norms, right? All the 80s observational stuff. It's like, did you ever notice this? Like what we usually attribute to Seinfeldian comedy. Did you ever notice this? And what's the deal with that, right? He was trying to do countercultural stuff at that time, and there weren't many doing it. So I think that's important. But a lot of you mentioned in your comments, like, anti-American, anti-establishment. Like, yeah, like he was countercultural for sure, and I think he wore that as a badge of honor. And I think I told this story this semester at some point, but the anti-American is really not. It's kind of a mischaracterization of someone like Carlin. Anti-establishment, sure, but anti-American, I don't think I would go that far. I mean, I think it shows that he cares a shitload about America. Or why would he care enough to sort of lay this all out for you and for himself if he didn't care? I've told this story about I got in an argument with a kid a few years ago in class about Trump or something, and I made a couple jokes, and he gave me the whole, love it or leave it, you don't have the right to. It's so amazing here compared to the rest of the world, and you're complaining about it. I'm like, no, fuck you, dude. Like, I'm not complaining. I'm stating the truth here, or how I see it, and I'm not happy with it. I expect more from this country that I love. I expect more from it. And then which led me to, I'm the most critical. We should be the most critical of the things we hold dear. There's nothing in the world I'm more critical of than my children. Like, why? Because I don't want them to just fucking be pieces of shit. I want them to, I expect more of them. The bar is higher for them. I want them to be successful and happy and all that kind of stuff. So I'm critical of them. And, so my kids and sitcoms and pizza, like, those are the things that I'm very critical of because I love them the most, right? So I think you're reading that anti-Americanism as, I think that's you're misreading that. I think he loves it, and as a result, I'd like it to be the best it can be. So I think that's where a lot of his passion comes from. Again, he wouldn't have done it for 60 years if he didn't care. You know, he certainly could have gotten by without it. Um, Caught between Carlin was sort of the origin of this little catchphrase that I use, and I've probably said it to you guys. Um, but he pointed out we as Americans for the most part would much rather coast with the bullshit than grapple with the truth at the end of the day. Like all this stuff about bullshit, bullshittery. One of you guys said bullshittery, and I giggled. I can't remember who it was, but thank you for that person who used bullshittery. Um, a lot of it, I think that's true. Like, as much as we claim to want the truth, do we really? Like, because I think if we knew the truth in many situations, we would not be equipped to deal with it. Um, bullshittery, Ben Telfer. Thank you for bullshittery. Um, but that idea, Carlin, Carlin made helped me come up with that saying. We'd rather coast with the bullshit than grapple with the truth, and I use it across curriculum, all my classes and things like that. It just keeps coming up, and I think it rings true. And he embraces that or embodies that more than anybody else. Um, Comedy should make us laugh, of course, but also ask us to think. I think that's one of the takeaways. And one of the things that I say to many of you were like, oh, he's a little much and, he's kind of preachy and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, but at the end of the day, I think he wants you to think about it. And if that happened, then we all win. And I think it did for most of you. We put some thought into what he was saying. Agree or not, you thought about it, right? And I think it's different for everybody. But a lot of times that when you internalize stuff like this and you think about it from a different perspective, like a lot of people react to his whole save the planet thing. This is the early 90s. He's calling attention to this concept, this idea that is a fledgling movement in the early 90s. And he's just, I think, offering another perspective on it. And I think a lot of what he has to say there is worthwhile, right? If nothing else, to shake us out of our daily just bullshit, basically. Like, listen, the environment is a thing, and here's my take on it. So just that you're thinking, I think, is what is important to him, Carlin, among others, in this situation. And I've said this before, I'll say it a million times again. The comedian doesn't care what you think when you leave. So that's why I don't think he's preachy. Preachy means convert. Preaching is trying to convert. You need to think like me. You need to, believe in the same things I do, all this kind of stuff. I don't think that's Carlin's end game. I think his end game is that you maybe rethink your shit and come out the other side more enlightened or more educated or whatever the word is there. But all good comedians, I think, are in that position. Like if everyone comes in and they listen to the comedian and they leave, the comedian doesn't care if they've changed your mind about a topic or whatever. They're not invested on that level, the level of a politician or, somebody, a religious person or something like that. They're not trying to get anything out of you other than, you know, your, I don't know, your cognitive uh, participation, I guess. Um, so oh, I enjoyed all your comments. A lot of similar stuff. Glad most of you seem to like him, and those of you who were torn, at least were, you know, trying to work through it. Brendan, who gave us bullshittery. Um, so these are just kind of my reactions to some of your comments. Even if you don't agree with him, you're usually looking at complex ideas in a more simplistic way. I guess that's what I just said, like right before this part, was that idea. And Ben sort of, I think Ben did. No, Ben, sorry, I got two names merged together. Ben said bullshittery. Brendan. Brendan said, that left the, Brendan Mallon said this comment. Making you look at it at complex ideas in a more simplistic way. Like that is one of the strengths of comedy, right? Makes these big ideas or concepts or institutions a little bit more digestible for us. We're a little more willing to listen and laugh and talk about and engage with these kinds of issues when it comes from a comedic perspective. Um, so even if you don't agree with him, the byproduct is you're looking at these things from a different angle. We should all say at least once a day, I never thought of it that way. Be humble enough and be open enough to difference and other ideas to be able to say, I never thought of it that way. Now, whether you continue to think about it that way or you go back to the way you previously thought is irrelevant to the comedian. But that you say, I never thought of it that way is, I think, next to laughter, a great reaction, for a comedian. Drew's comment made me think of this story that happened in class a few years ago, about how Drew said, like, his parents have, they're big Carlin fans, or Carlinites or something. I can understand why some people might be offended by some of Carlin's more blunt points, especially those that are anti-religion, anti-military, anti-America. Yeah, I had a kid in class, and I showed probably the same stuff that I showed you, and we started a discussion, and he raised his hand. He's like, I can't believe, like, that you showed those things, those anti-American, anti-military, anti-religious sentiments. Like, those are offensive to me. I can't. He was really upset. And I'm like, whoa, slow down. And he said he was from a military family. And, he kind of he was upset. So I was like, no, listen, like, I tried to talk him through it. And all this stuff I'm saying to you. And he kind of left in a huff. He was in no way soothed by any of my insights. So the next class he comes in, and before we even start class, he raises his hand. I'm like, hey, yeah, what's up? I thought he was gonna be like, so I did some digging. He goes, I want to apologize for my, for last class. I'm like, for what? Like, we're supposed to talk about this stuff. He goes, well, I went home and I called my parents, and I was so, like, upset that I had to tell them, like, this is what happened in class, and this professor, and he showed this guy, George Carlin, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, you know what their response was? His parents' response was, oh, yeah, George Carlin. We love George Carlin. He's amazing. And he's like, what? How could you say that? He said all this stuff about military and religion and America and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, yeah, it's, it's all bullshit. Like, Carlin's right. Like, we just choose to believe it and use it, to kind of shape our lives and our identities. We don't have a problem with it, but what he's saying is not necessarily, it's not lies, you know. And they were just had the perspective to understand the jokes and take away, maybe think about some things differently and then choose to be like, no, he's wrong on that. Like, engage in it at least. And the kid had shut down when he heard anti-America, military, religion. He's like, well, that's what I am, so fuck you. So that was a cool kind of thing, kind of lesson that that this kid had to learn. And Drew, your comments just kind of took me to that place. So thank you for that. Caitlin, your comment, Caitlin, made me think about Carlin's approach to comedy and how it's almost scientific. Like, a lot of you mentioned the whole separating yourself from the world, the culture, stepping back as a sort of an unbiased observer. And that I don't know a lot about science, but that's a scientific thing, right? You take yourself out of it emotionally. What he has is almost a scientific approach to comedy, removing himself and observing the data, quote unquote, without investment, emotion, or consequence in it. Like, if it has no impact on you, you can't use emotion to guide you and those kinds of things. Like, that's how I took it. And Caitlin's comment sort of brought me to that realization. I don't know, maybe you buy it, maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but I think it's an interesting way to look at it. Like, the whole, I'm not a part of it anymore. I'm just an observer. Like, it's a scientific approach to data. In this case, data is all these, things that bug, that all the bullshit, or the shit that's fucked up. Freddie was the most conflicted about how do I feel about Carlin, right? With the preachy and the back and forth. And my thought is, I think Carlin's intention is to make us think about the things we take for granted or just blindly follow. Like, that's the bottom line. Is the thing which I was just talking about before. Just think about this stuff just for a minute, right? And be sure that the feelings and beliefs and values and morals that you have are your own and not imposed upon you by outside. And then Matt just brought up the nuns. I think that's just an interesting little story, how his mother was so worried that these nuns, they're religious and they won't understand. Oh, I'm sorry about the language. And they're like, no, like, this is a metaphor for the world. Like, let go of that shit. Right? He's using language to get to and expose bigger ideas and talk about things that are more than just being filthy for filthy's sake. Right? Like, there's a fundamental difference between those two things. Some comedians don't understand it, as we will see soon, and some do. So the nuns, and then the nuns having to have a secular education, right? Like, not just closing yourself off to, this is the one way to live, right? This is the things to believe. They were required to have a secular education, not a religious one. And that, I think, helps. It just helps broaden your horizon and your the scope of your intellect and things like that, and your understanding of the world. And that ties into a lot of the stuff we've been talking about before. So thank you, Matt, for bringing that up. And now the video is 35 minutes. So I will stop, and I have to pee, so I will do that too. Bonus word, if you got this far, comment using using the word triple in your comment on this post, and you get lots of extra credit. So, peace.